Broadcasting live from the School of Athens, this is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review Service. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Period 4 in the College Board's AP World History Concept Outline by discussing Key Concept 4.2. Key Concept 4.2 says, although the world's productive systems continue to be heavily centered on agriculture, major changes occurred in agricultural labor, the systems and locations of manufacturing, gender and social structures, and environmental processes. Go ahead and pause me, put it into your own words, and I'll be back with you in a second. Okay, hopefully you noted something like the emerging world economy saw changes to labor systems, manufacturing of products, and social relations. So in Key Concept 4.1, we talked about the things that gave rise to this new global economy, and now we're going to talk about some of the consequences. So let's go ahead and get started with Key Concept 4.2, Roman numeral 1, which states, beginning in the 14th century, there was a decrease in mean temperatures, often referred to as the Little Ice Age, around the world that lasted until the 19th century, contributing to changes in agricultural practices and the contraction of settlement in parts of the northern hemisphere. So I want to go ahead and mention two things here. One, that the College Board is incredibly good at run-on sentences, but then also whenever you have a specific historical term like Little Ice Age mentioned in the concept outline, that means that it can be used as an answer on the multiple choice test. So that's something to keep your eye on now and later. All right, so let's talk about that Little Ice Age, which I'm convinced the College Board only has in the curriculum because they want to talk about climate change, but since it's there, we might as well discuss it now. It was a 500-year period roughly in which world temperatures decreased. Now, why is that important, you're asking? I'm sure you're asking it. Well, one reason is because it allowed for the plague to spread. Lower temperatures mean lower immune systems, and also lower temperatures means more rats, which, of course, they bring their fleas and allows the plague to spread. Now, agriculture in the northern hemisphere really struggled during this time. So, with the need for less farm workers, serfs can work elsewhere. A lot of them move to cities looking for jobs, but of course, with less agriculture, there's less things to trade. Therefore, cities aren't necessarily hopping areas either. One of the most profound agricultural consequences we see here is that in China, where temperatures decrease by 2 degrees Celsius, you see less yield in rice, which causes a tumultuous population which doesn't have enough to eat. So because of this environment, there's a huge peasant uprising during the later part of the Ming dynasty, which of course allows for the Ming to be invaded by the Manchus, who start their own dynasty called the Qing. Now, you might think to yourself, well, the Manchus took advantage of, we're at the right place at the right time. However, they were there because of the Little Ice Age too. The Manchus who lived north of China were moving south because the Little Ice Age made it hard for them to farm. So you can see how this Little Ice Age really rocks the world. It also makes the impact of the Columbian Exchange that much more important, because during this time period, Europe is not able to grow their common crops that they had been growing before it, so they introduced new crops that can grow in colder weather, like the potato. Now, obviously, the Little Ice Age rocks the world in big ways, but it gives us one horrible thing above all else: Shakespeare. If it weren't for that Little Ice Age, which killed probably a lot of potentially good writers, we get Shakespeare. All right, moving on to Key Concept 4.2, Roman numeral 2. Traditional peasant agriculture increased and changed, plantations expanded, and demand for labor increased. These changes both fed and responded to growing global demand for raw materials and finished products. So let's go ahead and start this discussion by reviewing a concept that we talked about in period 3, which was the changes in European labor during the Middle Ages. So as peasants are no longer needed on farms because of increased technology and Little Ice Age, which requires less people on farms because there's less to grow, you start to see a surplus of workers move to urban areas, which of course when you have a surplus of workers, it leads to a drop in wages, so people are going to be paid less and their standard of living is going to go down. At the same time, you see the emergence of what are known as craft guilds, which is basically artisanal products that are created in people's houses. So this leads to the master journeyman apprentice system, which is illustrated there by that image. Go ahead and pause me if you need to know more about it. Now, the major point of this key concept in Roman numeral is the emergence of new types of labor systems, which is something that the College Board loves to ask. They asked a long essay question about it last year. Don't be surprised if it's something that you see down the road either in class or on the AP test. So let's talk about slavery pre-1492. Slavery has existed for most of human history. Make no mistake about it, this isn't something that just emerged after Columbus. The Romans practiced it, the Aztecs practiced it, the Abbasids practiced it. The Abbasids are the ones who are going to introduce African slavery to Europeans. They see Africans or Bantu-speaking people as lesser beings, and so they utilize them specifically for slavery. Now, like I said, they're the ones who introduce it to the Europeans. However, they abandoned it quite early on because of a massive slave uprising that took place in the 9th century. So where the Arabs stop using it, the Europeans just keep on trucking. Okay, Africa also utilized slavery. The most common form was female domestic slaves. However, slave trading was something that did occur in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, and Africans trading other Africans. However, during the early modern period, slavery is going to take on a whole new look. And before we get to African slavery, let's talk about the less known and less cliche versions of slavery. So we talked about Zheng He in Key Concept 4.1's video. But I want to remind you that he was a slave. He was born a Muslim in Western China and was taken as a prisoner of war and made into a royal slave. And he eventually became an admiral and had a very astonishing life. However, he did begin as a slave. In Japan, the daimyo practiced formal kidnapping. Tokugawa Ieyasu was formally kidnapped and taught to be a samurai. So there you have slavery. And then, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, where they're practicing the devshirme, many of the janissaries were technically slaves. So there was slavery going on in other places. However, the dominant form of slavery, or coerced labor, as the College Board likes to call it being one form of coerced labor, is, of course, characterized by mostly African slaves who come to the New World on the Middle Passage. The journey of slaves usually starts by them being enslaved by other Africans due to warfare and other conflicts. They're traded for manufactured goods, and it is a system that is defined by inhumane treatment and basically the stripping of humanity away from somebody. It's turning them into basically cattle, which is the Latin offshoot of the word chattel. So we shouldn't be surprised that they were basically treated like animals. Now, of course, they come to the New World to work on the plantation systems to grow cash crops, notably sugar, coffee, and tobacco. Now, there's a great line by Sidney Mintz who states that these things are not necessities for life, and yet people are forced against their will, coerced, if you will, to grow them. Their wants, their desires, and it causes misery and suffering to grow them, and that's incredibly sad. Okay, moving on past that really sad moment, other New World labor systems that frankly weren't that much better. So we had indentured servitude that was practiced primarily by the British. This was a short-term coerced labor that usually ended in freedom after about 4 to 7 years. You signed a contract. It was mostly used on British tobacco plantations, which became prevalent in North America after 1607 with the first established colony at Jamestown. You also see the emergence of the Encomienda system, which is used primarily by the Spanish. So I don't want to confuse you on the Encomienda system, but it's kind of misunderstood a lot of times. So hopefully that makes sense here. The Spaniards who were settling in the New World technically had to rent the natives from the king and queen in return for converting the natives into Catholics. So technically the king and the queen had dominion over all the land and all the people who lived there. I don't think that the Indians would have agreed with that. But anyways, Spanish encomienderos who had plantations or other farms in the New World would technically rent the Indians from the king and queen. It's just an awful system. And then the last one we see is the Mita system, which was a coerced labor system before the Spanish even came to the New World. It was originally used by the Inca to build roads and other government projects in which Incan citizens had to pledge their labor for a certain amount of time in a year, It was their form of paying taxes. It was made it very easy for the Spanish to just come in and appropriate that labor for their purposes, and they were used mostly in silver mines. But that brings me to a question. Is not all labor coerced labor? I think that it is. You take a minute and you think about it. I'd love to hear what you think in comments. Okay, moving on. Key concept 4.2, Roman numeral 3. As social and political elites changed, they also restructured ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies. So we start to see that these global conquests and interaction are going to lead to new societal organizations. So we're talking about them in different places. In China, we see the Manchu conquest of the Ming. The Manchu are foreigners. They're people who the Ming saw as barbarians, and yet they're able to successfully conquer China, a lesson that I want all people who think that America is invincible to remember. In India, we see the Mughals, Muslims, rule over a primarily Hindu population. In Europe, we see the emergence of gentry and merchants who have a ton more money than peasants, and you see the growth of inequality. But the most notable interaction and societal reorganization is going to be that of the New World with the introduction of the casta system. So the casta system looks like that. It's your basic social pyramid, which we've seen so many times in this class. At the top, you have the peninsulares, who are Spaniards who are born in Spain but come to the New World. They're the whitest of white, I guess, and that's why they get to be at the top, and also they have the most money. The Creoles are those who are born in the New World to peninsulare parents. So this is going to lead to an elite group of people in the New World who hold an exalted status because of who their parents are, but still they're beneath the peninsulares because they're seen as not as pure. Below the Creoles are the mestizos, who are born of Spanish and Native American or Indian parents. You can imagine that there are a lot of these for reasons that I don't want to talk about now, so I won't. Below that, you have Native Americans and the Indians, of course, which is a diminishing number because of disease, and then towards the bottom you have enslaved persons. I also want to make mention that you can add to this mulattoes, which would be half peninsulare and half African slave, also is a new part of that stratified group. If you want to get a sense of how many different ethnicities we were dealing with, here's a very famous oil canvas painting of the different castas in this new Spanish system. You can see that up here in the top left-hand corner you have the peninsulare types, and then down here you have the lowest on society. Okay, in addition to that, we see that power of existing political and economic elites was challenged in different places. So for example, the zamindars, who are the tax collectors in the Mughal Empire, were challenged by the Hindu majority. And we see peasant uprisings in China, the White Lotus Rebellion, that's eventually put down by the dynasty, but 100,000 people are killed. You also see the daimyo in Japan. Their power is decreased when the Tokugawa shogunate consolidates power. And so the daimyo, who had traditionally been landed aristocracy in Japan, see their power decrease. So there's changes in power. Now, in addition to that, there's notable family and gendering restructuring that's occurring throughout the world. I'm going to give you one case study here. Africa is the best example of this. Slavery, of course, decreased the male population tremendously, and it leads to this population imbalance, which causes natural decrease in population because you don't have as many men and women. It also leads to increase in violence because the African clans are vying for position against one another. It also increases the dependency on manufactured foods and other goods. Manufactured goods is what that should say, which leads to an unequal distribution of resources, which leads to an unequal distribution of wealth. Man, this is depressing. Anyways, that's how we reach nirvana, at least now. Now, this episode has been super depressing, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it with this. Here is me working in a sugar plantation.